It was the kind of evening where time feels suspended, a golden hour hanging soft over the rooftops of suburban Spokane, Washington. Lawn sprinklers clicked rhythmically in distant yards, the smell of grilled chicken drifted lazily through open kitchen windows, and children's laughter rang out like background music for a neighborhood that never seemed to change. On the corner of West Granger Avenue, Corey Lambert, a slender 9-year-old with a chipped front tooth and a mop of sun-bleached hair, was crouched behind the neighbor's hedge, knees pressed into dry soil, eyes wide with anticipation. It was just another round of hide-and-seek, the 6th or 7th that day, and this one, like all the others, felt more like a ritual than a game. His cousins, a mix of older boys and younger girls visiting from Portland for the weekend, were counting loudly on the driveway. Corey had darted off early, giggling to himself, convinced this time he'd picked the perfect hiding spot. No one saw exactly when he disappeared. The game had begun around 6:30 p.m., just after his aunt handed out popsicles and reminded everyone to stay within the block. Corey's mother, Lisa Lambert, was inside prepping dinner, occasionally glancing out the window to check that all was well. The other children moved through their usual spots, under porches, behind trash bins, inside sheds left slightly ajar. But Corey had always been the competitive one. He liked to stretch the rules a little further, to disappear just long enough to make them nervous before springing out with a triumphant yell. So when he didn't appear right away, no one worried. At first. By 7 o'clock, shadows had grown longer. The sun dipped lower behind the line of elms bordering the street. Corey's cousin Paige was the first to say something felt wrong. She'd checked all the usual places, even the weird ones. The tight crawl space under the deck, the recycling bin, the hollowed-out stump near the green belt. She couldn't find him. Still, the others assumed he was just being clever. Maybe he'd crossed the street, which they weren't supposed to do, or maybe he was under a car. They spread out wider, called his name, yelled that the game was over, but there was no answer. Lisa noticed the shift in energy before anyone knocked on her door. The laughter was gone, replaced by silence and a tension she could feel in her chest before she even asked what was wrong. When Paige stammered that Corey wasn't coming out, something inside Lisa dropped. She didn't raise her voice or scream. She simply walked the perimeter herself, calmly, methodically, checking all the places he might have gone. Her steps grew faster, her breath caught. By 7:14, she was dialing 911, voice trembling, trying to explain that her son had vanished in the middle of a suburban game. The first patrol car arrived in minutes. Officers approached the house with a mix of urgency and reassurance, trying to calm a mother, already spiraling. The neighbors gathered without being asked. Some brought flashlights. Others began knocking on garage doors, asking to look inside. By 8 p.m., more officers had arrived, cordoning off the block and organizing volunteers. A local pastor opened the community center for what was quickly becoming a staging area. By 8:30, a helicopter had been called in, its spotlight sweeping the tree lines. Lisa Lambert stood in the middle of her front lawn, arms wrapped around her own waist as if trying to keep her body from falling apart. No one wanted to say it, but the adults knew something wasn't right. Kids don't just disappear, not like this. Not in the middle of a game, not on a street where people leave their front doors unlocked and wave to each other every morning. Yet, hour after hour passed and Corey didn't come running back with dirt on his knees and a mischievous grin. Volunteers combed the nearby woods. Canine units sniffed backpacks and bedroom sheets. Doors were knocked, attics were searched, sheds were opened, and drainage pipes were inspected. Corey's name was called into the night until voices cracked and flashlights dimmed. But there was nothing. No torn fabric, no footprints, no sign that Corey had ever moved beyond that hedge. As midnight approached, Lisa sat on the curb, wrapped in a neighbor's blanket, shoes off, phone clenched in her hand, though no one was calling. Her ex-husband arrived from 2 towns over, visibly shaken, and officers took him aside to ask the first of many questions. A detective gently asked for a recent photo. Lisa provided one from her phone. Corey at a school field trip, squinting at the camera, smile crooked, arms slung around 2 friends. They printed flyers that same night. And yet behind the growing urgency, behind the late-night media vans that began to park at the end of the block, Behind the floodlights and the yellow tape stretched across hedges and driveways, there remained a single unanswered question. If Corey was just playing hide and seek, where had he gone? Because something in that street, something beneath the surface of normalcy, had shifted. And by dawn, as the sun rose over a street still crawling with searchers, everyone knew Corey hadn't simply run away. Something else had happened, something no one yet understood. The initial urgency hardened into something far more grim by the time the second patrol car pulled up to the Lambert residence. It had only been 15 minutes since Lisa Lambert placed the call, but in missing child cases, every second stretches. The responding officers didn't waste time. The standard missing child protocol was activated immediately. They began with the basics: names, clothing description, last confirmed sighting. And then the sweep began. Flashlights stabbed into every corner of the block. Neighbors opened their homes without hesitation. Garage doors yawned open. Backyards, tool sheds, and even flower beds were inspected as the perimeter of the search widened by the minute. Within an hour, the Spokane Police Department had issued a missing child bulletin across all local radio frequencies. By dusk, the neighborhood didn't resemble itself anymore. It looked like the staging ground of a small-scale emergency operation, because in many ways, it was. By 8:40 p.m., a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging circled overhead. The steady chop of the blades underscored the anxiety now thick in the air. Its infrared camera scanned the woods, rooftops, and nearby retention ponds. The floodlights cast long shadows across manicured lawns, searching for a small body that might have curled up somewhere cold and hidden. Meanwhile, 2 search dogs, German shepherds trained for scent detection, were brought in and given a pillowcase from Corey's bedroom. One of them picked up a faint trail that led through the hedge where Corey was last seen, then abruptly stopped in the middle of the street. No deviation, no continuation, just a hard, inexplicable stop. The handler looked up, puzzled. It was as if the scent had been lifted into the sky and carried away. Volunteers began showing up in large numbers, some with flyers already printed, others with headlamps and backpacks ready to comb through the forest edge. A local high school track team arrived as a group, offering to divide into sectors. Parents who had never spoken to each other outside carpool lanes now stood shoulder to shoulder, crossing fields and wooded ditches, their calls of "Corey" growing more ragged with each passing hour. Despite the flood of people, equipment, and goodwill, the result was the same: nothing. Not a footprint in the mud, not a scuff on a fence, not a candy wrapper or lost toy. One searcher, an off-duty firefighter, remarked it was like chasing a ghost. Another said it was the first time he ever felt afraid to be in his own neighborhood. Detectives began conducting structured interviews. Every cousin, neighbor, adult, and bystander who had been present that day was asked the same series of questions. When was the last time you saw Corey? Did he say anything unusual? Did you see any unfamiliar vehicles? Every response was recorded, cataloged, and compared. A timeline was assembled piece by piece, but there was a gap between 6:32 p.m. and 6:37 p.m., a crucial 5-minute window when no one had eyes on him. One cousin remembered hearing a squeaky wheel, maybe a cart or a dolly, but dismissed it at the time. Another thought: she saw a white panel van parked near the corner but wasn't sure. The officers logged every detail, however small, knowing that in cases like these, sometimes the smallest thing unlocks everything. By midnight, the command post had grown. A mobile unit from the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team was en route. Search maps covered makeshift tables. Someone posted a list of areas already checked: storm drains, crawl spaces, irrigation, ditches, electrical boxes. One unit had even scoured the school buses parked at the nearby elementary lot. Another had checked every dumpster within a 4-block radius. Still nothing. No clothing fibers, no fingerprints, not a single broken branch. It didn't make sense. Children don't just vanish. The detectives knew that. Everyone knew that, but Corey had. It was around 2 a.m. when Detective Laura Meek stepped away from the search line and walked back toward the hedge where Corey had last been seen. She crouched low, flashlight sweeping over the soil and leaves, There were no drag marks, no fresh prints, not even a crushed blade of grass. It was pristine, undisturbed. She stood in silence, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew. Something had happened here, something sudden, something that left no trace. She looked up at the lamplight haloing above her and whispered under her breath, "Where did you go, kid?" As the sun crept over the horizon, painting the sky in muted orange, the volunteers looked hollow-eyed. Lisa Lambert had refused to sleep, sitting upright in a lawn chair wrapped in a donated blanket. She hadn't spoken since midnight. Her sister sat beside her, gripping her hand. Every so often, a neighbor would kneel down and whisper a word of support, but it always ended the same way. No one knew what to say to a mother whose child had evaporated in front of a dozen people without a sound. Daybreak brought with it more equipment, more resources, and more faces, but it also brought the first real wave of doubt, not in Corey, not in his mother, but in the circumstances. Investigators began to realize they weren't dealing with a lost child. This was something else, something harder to explain, something that felt deliberate, because despite hundreds of eyes, a fully mobilized search effort, and every inch of ground turned over twice, there was not a single piece of physical evidence to prove Corey Lambert had ever moved beyond that hedge. By the end of the first week, Corey Lambert's name was everywhere, plastered across utility poles, circulating in missing persons databases, and dominating evening news broadcasts. His disappearance wasn't just local news anymore. National outlets had picked up the story, drawn in by the unsettling silence left in his wake. How could a child vanish in a matter of minutes from a family gathering in broad daylight, with no witnesses, no signs of struggle, and no evidence left behind? Journalists flocked to Spokane, crowding the sidewalks, interviewing neighbors, and positioning themselves just beyond the police tape. The Lambert front yard, once a space of birthday parties and summer cookouts, now felt like a live broadcast studio. Cameras rolled constantly, satellite trucks parked at odd angles, reporters delivered emotionally charged sound bites, ending every segment with the same line: "Anyone with information is urged to call." With attention came speculation. Online forums exploded with activity, drawing in thousands of users, some well-meaning, others destructive. Theories ranged from the reasonable to the unhinged. Some insisted Corey had wandered into the nearby woods and simply got lost. Others were convinced he'd been lured by a stranger. More extreme voices accused his own family, despite no supporting evidence. Lisa Lambert's image was dissected mercilessly. Her mannerisms, her clothing, and even her voice tone during press conferences. One viral post claimed she hadn't cried enough. Another accused her of faking emotion. The internet was eating itself alive, fueled by unanswered questions and the emotional void left by Corey's absence. Inside the police command center, however, the tone remained professional, methodical, and quietly desperate. Investigators re-interviewed every single person present that evening, adults and children. They cross-checked timelines, verified phone records, and examined security camera footage from nearby homes and traffic intersections. One by one, every relative and neighbor was ruled out. Alibis aligned, polygraph tests came back clean. There were no reports of screaming, no sounds of a struggle, and no evidence of anyone running or panicking during the crucial 5-minute window. The assumption that Corey had simply walked away no longer held weight. He was 9. He knew the neighborhood. He was playing a game, and he had vanished too quickly, too completely. Attention gradually shifted to a vehicle that had left the neighborhood during the game, a rented moving van with out-of-county plates. It was a minor detail at first, noted by one of the cousins who remembered seeing it roll past just as the game began. The tip was cross-referenced with neighborhood footage, and confirmed. A white panel van with signage on the side reading Northland Movers had turned off the street at approximately 6:36 p.m., just minutes after Corey was last seen. That was enough to trigger a deeper inquiry. Police traced the registration to a small moving company headquartered in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, with a satellite office operating in Spokane. The van had been logged as part of a residential move scheduled for the same day. Detectives contacted the company and arranged interviews with the two movers assigned to the job, Martin Price and Devin Hall. Both were in their late 30s with no criminal history, clean drug records, and standard employment files. They claimed to have loaded furniture from a home 2 blocks over and driven to a storage facility on the edge of town, where the contents were being placed into a unit at the request of a client. The timeline appeared to match. Surveillance footage from the storage facility showed them arriving at 7:05 p.m. and unloading without incident. Neither man remembered seeing or hearing a child during the job, nor did they recall any unusual activity on the street. Still, investigators brought in the van for forensic analysis. Technicians conducted a full inspection. Luminol was sprayed to detect traces of bodily fluids. Swabs were taken from door handles, the cargo area, and the wheel wells. Cadaver dogs were brought in and sniffed the interior. But nothing tested positive. No blood, no fingerprints that didn't belong to the workers or the client, no clothing fibers, no strands of hair, not even a misplaced shoelace. The interior of the vehicle was disturbingly clean, too clean for a working truck. But there was no legal basis to pursue charges and no forensic evidence tying the van to Corey's disappearance. The lead, promising as it had seemed, dissolved into smoke. The media picked up the story about the van almost immediately, pushing the narrative that police had let suspects walk free. The two movers became targets of harassment, despite public statements from detectives clearing them of involvement. Online forums erupted with speculation. Was the storage unit connected somehow? Had Corey been taken there? Was he still alive? Detectives were forced to pivot. Without probable cause or a search warrant, they couldn't simply open random units. The storage company refused voluntary access, citing privacy laws. The case stalled. Behind closed doors, the department began to admit what no one wanted to say out loud. The trail was starting to dry up. The tips were becoming less credible. Psychic hotlines had begun calling. Reporters started asking if this would become another cold case. And yet, for Detective Laura Meeks, there was one detail she couldn't let go of: how a scent trail picked up by dogs had ended abruptly in the middle of the street, at the precise location where the van had turned. There was no proof of abduction, no witnesses, no confession, but in her gut, it didn't feel random. Someone had taken Corey. And if it wasn't the movers, then someone else had been watching that day. Someone who had timed it just right, who knew when eyes would be turned, and who had left no trace behind. The theory that Corey Lambert had been transported in a moving van, whether intentionally or by tragic accident, was the first tangible lead in an otherwise barren investigation. For nearly 2 weeks, detectives had grasped at fragments, timelines, scent trails, and vague vehicle sightings. The van, at least, had a destination: a registered storage facility on the eastern edge of Spokane County. A sterile row of corrugated steel doors lined up like a concrete graveyard, the units indistinguishable except by number. It was one of those places where people store the things they don't want to throw away but can't bear to keep close. The record showed that the van had arrived at 7:05 p.m., the night Corey disappeared. Surveillance footage confirmed that 2 men exited the vehicle, unloaded furniture and boxes into Unit 112, and then left 27 minutes later. There was no sign of Corey, no unusual behavior. Still, the detectives couldn't ignore the coincidence. If Corey had somehow been hidden in that van, intentionally or not, this might be the last place he was alive. They requested access to the unit the next morning. The storage facility manager, an older man with a crisp shirt and a well-rehearsed customer service smile, stood his ground. He acknowledged the police presence and the importance of the investigation, but without a search warrant or probable cause, his hands were tied. Unit 112 was under a valid rental agreement. The company couldn't violate its privacy policy. It didn't matter that a child was missing. It didn't matter that time was slipping away by the hour. Legally, the door would stay shut. Detectives filed for a warrant, but the process wasn't simple. The van had tested clean. There were no witnesses, no evidence placing Corey inside the vehicle. Probable cause was thin. The judge overseeing the request pushed back, asking for more supporting documentation. Delays stretched from hours into days. In that time, officers parked discreetly near the storage lot, hoping someone might return. They monitored activity at the gate, logging entry codes and watching for repeat visitors. Nothing unusual surfaced. No one revisited Unit 112. No suspicious late-night movements, just a steady stream of renters unloading boxes, seasonal decorations, and old furniture. Meanwhile, investigators tried to reach out to the customer who had rented the unit in question. The client, listed under the name Thomas Garvey, was unreachable. His phone number led to a voicemail inbox that hadn't been set up. The address on file traced back to a mailbox rental at a UPS store. No utility records, no driver's license match in the state. It was a ghost identity, either fake from the start or a person who had since disappeared. Law enforcement escalated the request, but without a credible connection to Corey's disappearance, the legal hurdles held. Unit 112 remained sealed. News of the stalled warrant didn't make it to the press, but inside the command center, the mood had shifted. The possibility of Corey being inside that unit, injured, scared, or worse, haunted every conversation. The officers who had canvassed the neighborhood now found themselves helpless, boxed in by legal boundaries. Detectives who had been moving with urgency now stood idle, watching bureaucracy delay what felt like their only shot. At night, the theory echoed in hushed tones. What if he had hidden in one of the boxes? What if no one knew he was there? What if he was never meant to be taken? The longer they waited, the colder the trail became. Tips poured in from around the country. Sightings of a boy matching Corey's description flooded the hotline. A truck stop in Utah, a playground in Sacramento, a gas station in Montana. Each tip pulled resources in another direction, but none led anywhere. Video footage never matched. Witnesses misremembered. In one case, the boy turned out to be someone's visiting nephew. The public was trying to help, but the volume of noise began to drown out the signal. Online theorists moved on to other stories. The national media turned its lens elsewhere. A week after the failed warrant, the team quietly moved the storage lead to the inactive pile, not because they believed it was dead, but because there was nowhere left to take it. Detective Laura Meeks never quite let it go. She had requested a secondary review of all footage around the unit, hoping something might have been missed. A reflection, a sound, a shadow. But the hours dragged on without revelation. The longer Corey remained missing, the less the story resembled a case, and the more it resembled a wound that wouldn't close. For Lisa Lambert, the storage facility came to symbolize a kind of silent cruelty. She had driven there once, sat in her car for an hour, staring at the row of metal doors. She didn't approach the office. She didn't ask questions. She just sat, hoping for something to break the silence. It didn't. When the warrant finally came through, 24 days after Corey vanished, officers cut the lock on Unit 112. What they found inside was painfully ordinary. Furniture, household appliances, a treadmill, and boxes of paperwork. No secret compartments, no unusual scents, no trace of a child. The space was dusty but undisturbed. If Corey had ever been there, he was gone now. And whatever lead they thought they had was nothing more than a dead end disguised as a lifeline. The case didn't stall. It simply sank. Investigators returned to square one. And somewhere in Spokane, a storage unit door closed behind them with nothing left but questions. By the time 5 years had passed since Corey Lambert vanished, the urgency that once blanketed the town had thinned into something quieter, heavier, but quieter. What was once breaking news became background noise. New stories pushed Corey's case further down the cycle until even the occasional anniversary mention on the local stations stopped coming. In Spokane, the sidewalk chalk tribute outside the Lambert house had long since faded, washed away by rain and forgotten by children who had moved on to middle school. The flyers were gone. The porch light his mother left on for months burnt out one night in silence, and she never replaced it. Grief had taken up permanent residence in the home, lingering in every corner like smoke that never fully cleared. By 2017, the house was quieter than ever, because Lisa and Mark Lambert no longer lived in it together. They had separated the year prior. Not out of anger, but exhaustion. They simply couldn't carry the weight anymore. Not under the same roof, not in the same rooms where Corey once played. They still spoke occasionally, but never for long. Always about logistics, never about Corey. The vigils that once drew neighbors, classmates, and strangers had become smaller and more ceremonial. On the 5th anniversary, barely a dozen people gathered in the park with candles. There was no press, no media vans, and no updates from law enforcement, just silence and the gentle crackle of wax. It was no longer about hope. It had shifted into remembrance, though no one dared call it that. To say, "in memory of Corey," would be to acknowledge something they weren't ready to name. Lisa stood at the edge of the circle that evening, clutching the same photo the police had used on the first flyer. She left before anyone noticed. Inside the Spokane Police Department, Corey's case sat in a gray plastic box, filed under Missing Unresolved. Dozens of cases like his sat in identical containers on identical shelves, but one of them never gathered dust. Detective Laura Meek still kept the file on her desk, always within arm's reach, always open at the corner. It had become a quiet act of resistance. Laura had never moved on from Corey's case. She still had the map with its color-coded pins. She still kept the timeline spreadsheet up to date, and every week she checked the database for new tips, new links, and new missing children whose faces bore even the faintest resemblance to his. Most led nowhere. But some nights she'd sit with the file after hours, eyes scanning reports she'd read 100 times, waiting for something to feel different. It rarely did. Then, in early October of 2017, an anonymous tip arrived. Not through official channels, but hand-delivered to the station in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single printed receipt from a storage facility just outside the city, time-stamped from the week prior. The unit had been paid in cash. The name listed was unfamiliar, the handwriting shaky. But what caught Laura's attention wasn't the receipt itself. It was the note scribbled on the back in block letters. Someone's still paying to hide something. Unit 159. That was all it said. No explanation, no context, just enough to stir something long dormant. Laura ran the address. It was a privately owned facility she'd heard of before, but never had reason to investigate. She checked their records. Unit 159 had been rented since late 2012, just 3 months after Corey disappeared. Every payment had been made in cash. No linked phone number, no online account. She checked the rental signature. The name used, David R. Kemp, had no matches in any criminal or state database. A ghost identity again, like the one tied to Unit 112 years earlier. The facility itself was one of those low-security, 24-hour access lots with minimal oversight. No cameras inside the gate, no ID verification. Just a keypad code and a monthly fee. The kind of place where people stashed forgotten furniture, old tax documents, or things they didn't want found. She brought the tip to her superior officer the following morning, laying out the timeline, the patterns, and the circumstantial parallels to the earlier van in storage. Lead. He listened, nodded, but ultimately shook his head. No evidence of a crime, no direct link to Corey, and without probable cause, no judge would issue a search warrant. Laura pushed back, arguing the consistency and the history of similar dead-end leads that were never fully ruled out. But resources were limited, and priorities had shifted. The department had new cases, newer victims, and louder tragedies. Corey's file was no longer active. She was told she could keep an eye on it unofficially, but she wouldn't be assigned to investigate further. Not without something concrete. That night, Laura sat in her car outside the storage facility for nearly 3 hours. She watched the gate open and close, documenting every vehicle that entered. Most belonged to regular renters. A few were trucks, a few were lone drivers, none stayed long. No one approached Unit 159. Still, she returned the next night, and the one after that. She started keeping a log, a private one. Something in her refused to let this go, not because she was sure the answer was there, but because it was the only place left that still felt like it might hold one. And buried under that certainty was something else she hadn't admitted out loud in years. She didn't think Corey had wandered off. She never had. She believed someone had taken him, someone who had left town, kept their distance, paid in cash, and waited for the world to stop watching. Someone who might still be out there, alive, anonymous, and waiting for the final loose end to finally disappear. In November of 2023, just outside Bonners Ferry, Idaho, 45 miles northeast of Spokane, a modest gravel-lined storage facility was preparing for a routine auction. The kind of event that drew in curious locals and second-hand dealers looking for forgotten tools, salvaged antiques, or outmoded electronics. It was an end-of-season clearance, 23 delinquent units, all unpaid, all slated for lock removal and public sale. For the facility's longtime manager, Rick Connolly, it was a predictable routine. He'd handled dozens of auctions over the years, but Unit 76 stood out. The paperwork showed it had been rented in late 2012 under the name Thomas Garvey, a name that didn't appear on any government registry. The account had been kept active for over a decade, paid strictly in cash, dropped anonymously into the facility's after-hours box. There had been no phone number, no email address, and no forwarding contact. For 11 years, someone had gone to considerable lengths to keep the unit quiet. And then, 3 months earlier, the payments simply stopped. Rick had given the required notices, mailed certified letters, posted warning signs, and waited the full legal window. No response came. On November 17th, he stood outside Unit 76 with a crowbar in hand and a clipboard tucked under his arm. The metal door was coated in surface rust, the latch stiff from disuse, the dust at the base of the threshold hadn't been disturbed in years. When he pried the lock and lifted the door, a dry screech echoed across the lot. And immediately, it was clear. This wasn't abandoned furniture or long-forgotten office supplies. This was something else. The smell hit first, not rot or mold, but oldness, stale air, aged plastic, and dry dust. Inside, the unit was dim and tightly packed. There were no boxes, no furniture. Instead, there were scattered food wrappers from brands no longer in production. A few cartons of shelf-stable juice, a pile of plastic spoons, 2 dented soup cans with faded expiration dates. In one corner, a thin foam mattress lay folded beneath a stack of threadbare blankets. Near it was a small pile of items that didn't belong in storage. A red race car with a missing wheel, a worn stuffed dinosaur with one eye stitched shut, a handheld video game console with a cracked screen, arranged with too much care to be trash, but clearly untouched for years. As Rick stepped further inside, his flashlight caught something else, a child-sized backpack, sun-bleached from age, propped against the back wall. He knelt down slowly and lifted the flap. On the inside, stitched into the fabric in bright blue thread, was a single name, Corey. His breath caught. He knew that name. Everyone in the Pacific Northwest did. Corey Lambert, the boy who vanished from Spokane in 2012 during a game of hide-and-seek. 9 years old at the time, last seen running through a hedge in his mother's neighborhood, never seen again. No trace, no evidence, no confirmed sightings. Until now. Rick backed out of the unit and called the police immediately. The responding officers sealed the facility within the hour. The surrounding units were cleared. Evidence markers were placed. Within a day, the Spokane Police Department had arrived, and when Detective Laura Meeks stepped inside Unit 76, she stood frozen in the doorway. It was the backpack that stopped her cold. She had seen it before, in Lisa Lambert's hands the night Corey vanished, a detail etched into her memory, the small tear on the front pocket, the plastic keychain of a soccer ball attached to the zipper. It had been missing from the start. Now, it was here. Forensics began their work that night. The dust samples, food residue, and textile fibers were cataloged. A blacklight revealed faint smudges on the wall, small handprints low to the ground. Scratch marks lined the inside of the metal paneling in the far back corner, shallow and clustered. One of the blankets, when lifted, revealed a single slipper-sized shoe print on the cement. It was small and narrow, consistent with a child, consistent with Corey's size at age 9, but no remains were found, No blood, no bones, no DNA yet confirmed. It was as if a life had unfolded here and then disappeared, silently and completely. The biggest mystery wasn't what they found, it was how it had stayed hidden for so long. The payments had been precise. The renter had never missed a month until recently. All in cash, all without a paper trail. It suggested planning, obsession, or fear. Someone had maintained this place. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure this space remained untouched. Whoever they were, they knew what they were doing. The facility had no security cameras, no digital locks, the perfect place to hide something, or someone, for years. Inside the unit, the personal items told their own quiet story. The plush dinosaur had been positioned upright. The race car's missing wheel was placed carefully beside it. The backpack's contents included a crumpled photo of a boy with his arm around a Labrador retriever, a half-used coloring book, and a small notepad with 2 pages torn out. Nothing written remained. Still, to investigators like Meeks, the scene wasn't just a lead. It was a rupture. After more than a decade, Corey Lambert's trail was no longer cold. It was standing right in front of them. The question now wasn't just who had rented the unit, but why they had stopped. What changed after 11 years of silence? Had something happened to the person who kept paying? Had someone moved on? Or had someone decided the hiding place was no longer necessary? The door was open now, and what waited on the other side wasn't closure. It was the chilling possibility that the boy who vanished during a game had been closer all along, locked away and forgotten until a rusted lock finally gave up its secrets. The moment the evidence team stepped inside Unit 76, the tone of the entire investigation shifted. What had started as an overdue account and a broken lock quickly became something else, something that demanded silence, gloves, photographs, and protocols. There was no electricity inside, just the filtered gray light from the open roll-up door stretching across cement, casting long shadows over the past. It felt like no one had been in there in years. Dust floated in the air, thick and slow, disturbed only by the movement of the people now entering carefully, one step at a time. The space wasn't large, barely enough to park a small car, but every inch of it was arranged with the intimate imprint of a life that had existed, maybe even endured, inside it. The unit wasn't packed. It was sparse, almost deliberate in how little it contained, and that emptiness said more than clutter ever could. Against the back wall sat a thin mattress, child-sized, with a faded bedsheet still loosely draped over the foam. Its edges were curled up from age, and beneath it lay a shallow impression in the cement, as though someone had slept there night after night, unmoving, trying not to make a sound. Next to the mattress was a milk crate filled with comic books, Spider-Man, X-Men, and a tattered Archie digest with a 2012 publication date. The pages were curled and moisture-stained, their covers stuck together from time and heat. Beside them, a handheld video game. Console sat lifeless, battery cover missing, screen cracked. A thin layer of dust had settled over everything. Nothing had been touched in years. Technicians moved slowly, cataloging every object, bagging each item with care. Swabs were taken from the food wrappers, the blankets, and the plastic casing of the console. They vacuumed carpet fibers and searched for hair strands or saliva residue on the toys. The goal wasn't just to collect evidence. It was to preserve a timeline, to understand how long someone had lived here, and more importantly, who. The most damning find came from under the mattress, where a red toy car, wedged between the foam and the floor, was pulled out by a technician wearing nitrile gloves. Its wheels were rusted, and the underside bore a brownish stain that had dried into the plastic. Initial testing suggested blood, enough to raise alarms, enough to escalate this space from unusual to potentially criminal. The lab would confirm later that the blood was human, but none of it compared to the discovery carved into the beam above the mattress. A detective on site was the first to notice the rough indentations, almost obscured by age and dust. Someone had used a sharp object, maybe a nail, maybe a shard of plastic or metal, to scratch 5 words into the soft wood, words that stopped everyone in their tracks. I tried to get out. The words weren't artistic. They weren't evenly spaced or straight. They were jagged, uneven, and frantic, carved with effort, with fear. The implication hung heavy in the air. Someone had been trapped here. Someone had wanted to leave, and they had been here long enough, alone enough, to leave a final mark behind. Detective Laura Meeks stood outside the unit, arms crossed tightly over her chest, jaw locked. She had seen hundreds of cases in her career, abductions, runaways, even false alarms. But nothing like this. Not a space this quiet. This is controlled. This is calculated. It didn't feel like someone stashed a child here for a few hours or even days. It felt like someone had made this a world, a prison disguised as shelter. And that meant someone knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't spontaneous. This was planned, hidden, maintained. Forensics ran DNA comparisons against the national database. The match came within 48 hours. A partial profile consistent with Corey Lambert, hair follicles from the bedding, skin cells from the game console, and a fingerprint lifted from the backpack's zipper, all aligned. It was him. At some point in the last 11 years, Corey had lived in that unit. For how long, no one could say yet. There was no diary, no calendar, no digital devices with recorded time. But the layers of dust, the age of the items, and the expiration dates on the food wrappers, they all pointed to a period spanning months, maybe longer. What remained unclear was when or how he left. The absence of remains made things more complicated. There was no sign of death, no obvious trauma, no bones, no grave. And yet, there was blood. There were signs of distress, there were carvings. The unit screamed of containment, but not necessarily of finality, which opened the door to a possibility no one was prepared to name, that Corey had once been held here, then removed, relocated, or possibly escaped. Investigators couldn't rule out any option. The only certainty was that someone had paid for this unit, paid for it consistently, anonymously, and in cash, for over a decade. And then they had stopped. That choice, that decision to end payments, is what broke the silence. Not guilt, not justice, just money. Or maybe a mistake. The presence of Corey's belongings didn't just breathe new life into the case, it reversed its direction. Now investigators weren't just asking what happened to a boy who disappeared during a game. They were asking who kept him hidden and why they gave him a space that looked more like a time capsule than a cage. And the deeper question haunted every detective who reviewed the evidence. Did Corey carve those words in fear or in warning? Because if he had tried to get out, and if someone had kept him in, then someone had also made sure no one ever found him. Until now. By the time DNA tests confirmed that the hair follicles and fingerprints found in Unit 76 belonged to Corey Lambert, no one in the Spokane Police Department was surprised. They had known the moment they saw the backpack, the toys, and the blanket. But confirmation brought with it a final, undeniable weight. It proved that Corey hadn't been abducted and killed within hours of his disappearance, like so many feared in the early days. He had lived. For how long, no one knew yet. But somewhere between the walls of that rusted metal unit, a child had survived. That fact alone unraveled every assumption that had quietly hardened into belief over the years. And then, something else shifted. Because as investigators continued to examine the interior, one of the forensics techs crouching near the rear wall noticed something unusual in the ceiling. A faint seam, nearly invisible unless you were looking directly at it, in the plywood lining above. They brought in a stepladder and a flashlight, and within minutes they had confirmed it. A loose panel nailed into the rafters, covering a narrow crawl space above the unit. It wasn't listed in the blueprint of the facility, just a small hand-cut compartment tucked away like a hidden attic. When they pried the panel open and shone a light inside, the silence that followed was immediate. No one spoke. There, wrapped in a faded, unwashed blanket and curled in a fetal position near the far corner, lay a complete human skeleton. It was small and delicate, the bones of a child. Near the remains, there was a plastic container holding several folded papers, damp at the edges but still intact. A makeshift journal, bound with rubber bands and written in pencil on the backs of flyers, cereal boxes, and torn notebook pages. Detective Laura Meeks arrived an hour later. She stood beneath the open crawlspace, arms rigid at her sides, listening as the forensic anthropologist described what they had found. The remains would be sent for dental and DNA comparison, but there was no doubt. These were Corey's bones. And somehow, after all the searching, all the years, all the dead ends, they had been hidden above eye level, in a place no one had thought to look, in a unit police had once tried and failed to search over a decade earlier. Meeks felt her knees lock. She didn't cry. She just stared, quietly asking herself the same question circling through every investigator's mind. How long had he been alive before he died? The journal provided a window, painfully limited, but intimate. The handwriting changed over time, clumsy and round in early pages, later thinner, shakier, and desperate. Corey wrote sparingly, with the vocabulary of a child, but the content was clear. He described hiding in the metal room, drawing pictures and playing with his car. He wrote about hearing people walk past the unit, footsteps and voices, but being too scared to speak. The clearest entries involved the man, someone he never named, only describing him as tall with gloves and a scarf. Corey said the man brought food sometimes, crackers, juice boxes, and pudding cups. He said the man didn't speak much. Sometimes he looked angry. Other times he just stared. There were no explanations, no hints at how the arrangement began. Just a repeated phrase, written in different ways across multiple pages. I don't think he knows what to do with me. One entry, dated with no year, just Snow Week, stood out. Corey wrote that the man hadn't come back in many days. He wrote about rationing crackers, about trying to unscrew the latch on the door. He said he banged once, but stopped because he was afraid of being heard. He wrote that he had a stomach ache, that it was very cold, and that he missed his dog, Scout. It was one of the last entries. The pages that followed were mostly blank with faint scribbles, lines, half-drawn letters, then nothing. It was impossible to know the exact date of death, but the journal suggested Corey had been alive for at least several weeks, possibly months after his disappearance, maybe longer. The forensic timeline painted a bleak picture. Corey had likely died of starvation or exposure. There was no evidence of blunt force trauma, no obvious skeletal damage. He had faded away quietly, in a space smaller than most closets, inches above a world that had forgotten him. And all the while, someone kept paying the bills, month after month, year after year, to keep that door shut, to ensure that what happened inside would never be found. The question of who that person was still remained. Records linked the rental account to the same fake identity used at the previous Spokane storage unit years earlier. A man calling himself Thomas Garvey. But there were no fingerprints, no license, no digital trail. Investigators now believed the man who had taken Corey was not a career criminal. He had no known connection to the family. He likely hadn't intended to hold Corey for years. It was more probable that something unplanned happened, a moment of impulse, then panic, then containment. And once Corey was inside that unit, the man didn't know how to return him. So he didn't. He created a system, fed him, hid him, and eventually stopped showing up altogether. Maybe he moved, maybe he died, maybe he simply decided to let the space, and whatever was in it, fade with time. Detective Meeks read the journal 3 times in silence. On her 4th pass, she stopped at one sentence Corey had written near the beginning. I don't yell because maybe they'll find me if I'm quiet. She read it again, then closed the pages gently and placed them in the evidence bag. The boy who vanished in the middle of a game had survived long enough to wait for rescue, and then died in silence, trusting that someone would come. But no one had. Not in time. And now, the final questions remained. Who was the man behind the payments, and why, after all those years, did he stop? The fingerprint confirmation left no room for speculation. It wasn't a partial match or an uncertain lead. It was a full, clean print taken from the back page of Corey Lambert's makeshift journal, lifted carefully from the worn, folded paper that had survived more than a decade in silence. Forensics cross-checked it against employment records and public databases. It didn't match anyone in the criminal system, but it matched an archived employment file from a now-defunct moving company in Spokane. The name was Martin Price. On paper, he was unremarkable. No criminal record, no history of violence, no public red flags. Just a man who, at the time of Corey's disappearance in 2012, had been working part-time for Northland Movers. His name had never surfaced during the original investigation. He wasn't listed as a suspect, not interviewed, not even mentioned in connection to the van that had briefly drawn attention before the case went cold. He had slipped through entirely. But when detectives pulled archived records, they found him on the job sheet for a residential move 2 blocks away from the Lambert residence. The same day, Corey vanished during a game of hide-and-seek. Price had been listed as a second assistant, someone who loaded boxes, drove the van, and stayed quiet. The person who stayed in the background. Reviewing the old neighborhood footage, they found it. Grainy, low-resolution surveillance from a home security system facing the street. At 6:36 p.m., a white panel van drove past. 2 men were in the front. One, the driver, leaned forward into view. It was Martin Price. His eyes locked on something outside the E-to frame, something to the right, near the hedge where Corey was last seen hiding. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He just stared as the van rolled past. It wouldn't have been enough for an arrest, even if Price had been alive. But he wasn't. Detectives learned that Martin Price had died in a single vehicle crash in late 2021. His death hadn't made the news. He had no immediate family, no listed next of kin. Just a coroner's report and a police file describing a quiet, isolated man who had driven off a back road in northern Idaho and hit a tree head-on. No drugs, no alcohol, no skid marks, no suicide note, just impact. The kind of ending that doesn't raise questions unless you're looking for them. At the time, no one was, but now they were. Investigators began combing through what little remained of Price's life. A storage receipt found among his personal effects matched the Idaho facility where Corey's remains had been found. A former co-worker recalled that Price once mentioned owning a few storage units, but nothing more. A former landlord remembered boxes stacked to the ceiling and long hours spent sitting in his car without moving. Several described him as quiet, solitary, odd. One called him harmless. Another remembered an episode years earlier when Price had spoken to someone who wasn't there. Police began building a psychological profile and discovered what they had already suspected. Martin Price likely suffered from untreated schizophrenia for most of his adult life. No records existed of medication or hospitalization, no therapy, no diagnosis. But the behavior was consistent: paranoia, detachment, isolation, and disorganized thinking. It was all there in hindsight. So the question became, what did he see on June 3, 2012? Did he recognize Corey as a child playing a game, or did his mind twist the situation into something else, something dangerous or distorted? Did he believe he was rescuing Corey, protecting him, keeping him hidden from imagined threats? Investigators now believe that whatever Price's initial reasoning, it was not rooted in cruelty, but confusion. That he may have placed Corey in the back of the moving van and driven him away without clear intention. That once the panic wore off, he didn't know how to return him, and that instead of going to the police or returning the child to his family, he made a devastating decision: to hide him. The evidence now suggested that Corey was first kept in the Spokane storage unit, Unit 112, the one detectives had tried to access but were legally blocked from entering. After a period of time, possibly months, Price transferred Corey to the facility in northern Idaho. There, he built what appeared to be a rudimentary shelter, a mattress, canned food, and a few toys. He paid the rent every month without fail, all in cash, all under the alias Thomas Garvey. It was the same name used in Spokane, a fake name attached to 2 cities, 2 units, and one boy's fading life. Corey's journal filled in some of the gaps, confirming that he had received food, sporadically, from a man who said little and always wore gloves. The man never introduced himself. He came at night. He sometimes stayed for minutes, other times longer. And then, one day, he didn't come at all. Corey wrote about waiting, about rationing crackers, about being scared to yell. And eventually, the entries stopped. Experts believe Price likely withdrew from the unit entirely around the time his mental condition worsened. He may have dissociated. He may have convinced himself Corey was no longer there, or he may have simply forgotten. No one will ever know exactly what happened between the two of them inside those storage walls. The silence lasted too long. The answers died with Martin Price, but the evidence, those fingerprints, that footage, the journal, and the payments, paints a picture that is tragically coherent. A sick man, slipping through cracks, made a decision in a moment that changed everything. And instead of being stopped, questioned, or found, he blended into the background like he always had. And while Corey's family searched, while vigils were held and tips came and went, the man responsible was driving past the edge of the search grid every day, paying for silence, locking the door behind him, and leaving a little boy to be forgotten. Until the day he forgot to keep paying. The box arrived at the Spokane coroner's office on a quiet Tuesday morning, sealed, labeled, and transported under escort. Inside were the final remains of Corey Lambert, meticulously collected from the storage unit that had hidden his fate for over a decade. Forensic teams had confirmed the identity through dental records, but for his family, confirmation had come weeks earlier when they saw the backpack, the journal, and the carved words in the wooden beam above the mattress. There were no questions left to ask, just a silence that wrapped around the truth and settled deep into their lives. Lisa Lambert sat in the front row of the funeral home, hands in her lap, a framed photo of Corey on the pew beside her. His father, Mark, sat 3 seats away, a distance that had grown in the years since their son disappeared and now felt permanent. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already happened in the spaces between those lost years. The ceremony was private. No cameras, no statements, no reporters. Just close family, a few neighbors who had never stopped showing up to the annual vigils, and one detective, Laura Meeks, seated quietly in the back. The service was short. There was no eulogy, no recounting of Corey's favorite songs or hobbies. There were no memories of high school, no slideshow of milestones that had never come. There was only a small, child-sized casket and the reality of what had been found inside that steel box in Idaho, a frozen moment in time that should have never existed. But the silence outside the room didn't last. Once the story broke in full, the public's reaction was immediate and visceral. Outrage spread online and across national newsrooms. How could a boy disappear so close to home, only to be discovered in a place that investigators had once attempted to access, but were denied? How could legal red tape, rental agreements, and jurisdictional hesitations allow a child to remain hidden in plain sight for over 11 years? The fact that Corey had been taken, likely within minutes of his family losing sight of him, and remained alive for weeks or months inside a rented storage unit, while an entire city searched, felt like a national failure, not just a failure of justice, but of systems, procedures, and assumptions. He hadn't been hundreds of miles away. He hadn't been sold or smuggled or moved through an underground network. He had been right there, in the next county, behind a locked door that no one opened. The district attorney's office responded quickly, commissioning a full internal review. The final report ran over 200 pages and left no institution unscathed. It criticized the narrow interpretation of search warrant thresholds in missing child cases. It highlighted how outdated property privacy laws tied the hands of early investigators. It documented the 2012 request to access Unit 112 and the subsequent legal block that halted the one lead that could have changed everything. It called out resource constraints, coordination breakdowns between counties, and a cultural tendency to presume the worst too early. That runaway or stranger abduction was the only explanation worth chasing. It concluded with a recommendation that would eventually become known as Corey's Clause, a proposed change in state law granting investigators temporary access to commercial storage spaces in active missing child cases under emergency court orders. That clause would pass less than 5 months later, setting off a wave of similar reforms in other states. But policy didn't comfort Corey's parents. It didn't explain the journal entries, the crude drawings, the silence, the desperate notes written on cereal box cardboard. And it didn't change the final page of that journal, the one that broke every person who read it. Written in pencil, in slanted, thinning handwriting, it read, "I hear birds again. Maybe today's the day." For investigators, that line was proof of life, proof that Corey had still believed he might be found, that the sound of birds meant morning, and morning meant people, and people meant a chance to escape. For Lisa Lambert, it meant something else. She had once told a reporter, back when the story was still fresh, that Corey used to sleep with the window open just to hear the birds at dawn, that he loved the idea of waking up to something alive. His final words, scrawled on the back of an old flyer and tucked beneath his blanket, had been, "A signal sent into darkness, meant for someone who never came." Detective Laura Meeks kept that page printed, laminated, and stored in her desk drawer. She didn't revisit it often, but she kept it close. She had worked the case longer than anyone else and in many ways had never left it. She had stood in the storage unit, felt the air, seen the toys, and read the journal. And now, as policies changed and other departments reached out for advice on how to reform their missing persons protocols, she gave them what they asked for: procedures, checklists, models. But what she really wanted them to understand was something that couldn't be documented, that when a child goes missing, the clock doesn't just matter, it defines everything. Because Corey hadn't been invisible. He had been right there, waiting, listening to the sound of the world just outside the metal walls that kept him in. The day after the funeral, someone left a bundle of blue balloons tied to the old hedge where Corey had been last seen. No one saw who did it. A handwritten note was taped to the base. It read, "We found you, sweet boy. We're sorry it took so long." And for the first time in over a decade, the wind moved gently across the yard without the weight of unanswered questions. Just grief, and something that looked a little like closure.